All right, let's talk about Jamestown. So, when you think about Jamestown, you may or may not think about anything, but if you do think about something, you probably think about the story of Pocahontas, right? So, these all kinds of differing stories, myths, and mythologies about Pocahontas. Like you might think of, John Smith, or maybe even like the Disney version of, this love story between John Smith and Pocahontas, if I remember it right. It's been so long since I've seen it, but, this colors of the blue corn moon. But a lot of us don't really know what happened in Jamestown. So I think it's kind of important to understand a couple of key points and then kind of understand the trajectory of what happens with Jamestown. Because if you understand essentially the emergence of Jamestown, the evolution that Jamestown goes through, then you can understand a lot about the early American culture and even culture now, because we're going to see the establishment of representative government simultaneously with the establishment of racial slavery that happens at the same time. And so I want us to really understand that as we go. There's a few things I think we can say about John Smith or Pocahontas, right? Pocahontas never had a romantic relationship with John Smith. John Smith was this very kind of outgoing, I think of him as an English conquistador type, right? He's depending on who you ask, he's either heroic or, this kind of narcissistic, selfish person that's very, whatever it is, his qualities, he becomes a leader, right? He's going to essentially lead these English colonists. They hit here off the coast of Virginia at the Chesapeake Bay. When they land here, the Native Americans have kind of not heavily populated this specific place they were in because it was prone to disease. It didn't grow food that well, right? So when they come here, essentially what you have is a group largely of male noble-ish background. They're more of elites. They're coming here essentially to do what the conquistadors did, right? To establish a colonial rule. And they're not really good at, say, farming or, taking care of animals, the things that you need to subsist in rural Virginia. Like it's really cold in the winter, right? So when they get here, they hit, and very quickly they don't have what they need. They're not able to produce the food they need. They're not able to produce essentially a long-lasting settlement that's going to bring a return, and they start dying off really quickly. And so John Smith, the story is he essentially goes out, he comes into contact with Chief Powhatan, who is this leader over a large, diverse group of Eastern woodland Native American people that are tied together, tens of thousands of people that are tied together through this Algonquin language group. And so the story, right, is that he's going to be killed, and Pocahontas steps in front of him. She's going to save him, right? And then depending on what you listen to, they fall in love or whatever. They don't fall in love, right? The story is that he's going to be killed, and she intervenes in some way, right? And historians debate about what this means, but it seems to mean that his accepting her help was kind of a ritual in some way, that he was going to be submissive to the Chief Powhatan, right? And so there's this uneasy relationship that happens for a number of years between the Jamestown settlers and the Chief Powhatan and his larger group of Native Americans. Very early on, they're reliant upon them to help them last through the winter. They're very much dependent on Native Americans to help them get food, create some shelter, right? And so they're, because of the smallness of the Jamestown community in relationship to the large number of Native Americans, they're not really afraid of them at this point. They don't think that they're really a threat, and they help them out a little bit. Very quickly, this is a tense relationship that begins to fall apart, right? So Smith ends up, eventually going back to England. Pocahontas eventually does marry an Englishman, John Rolfe, a tobacco farmer, and that helps solidify some uneasy peace for a little bit, but eventually that begins to fall apart. By 1609, they call this the starving time, and they're so in need of resources and people. They begin to literally die out. They're starving to death, right? Without, in between help from the Native Americans. And we have archaeological evidence of people eating each other, eating dead bodies. One guy's executed for potentially killing his wife and eating her. If you go to Jamestown now, you can actually walk in and you can see a skeleton with fork marks on it, right? Like we have records of this, right? So definitely, they're at the very brink of dying out completely. But through the help of Native Americans, eventually they're able to survive, and eventually more people come, and although they almost don't make it, they end up persisting. Two really important things that happen simultaneously as Jamestown eventually becomes sustained and begins to slowly grow. The House of Burgesses and racial slavery become established in 1619 together. So I really want to focus on this point. You have the House of Burgesses, which is essentially a representative government where landowning white people can be represented in government. It's going to begin to move towards this notion of representative government in a very rudimentary way, right? Simultaneously, the White Lion, a Dutch trading ship in 1619, brings a number of African slaves for the first time to the Virginia colony. So the paradox of America that we know all the way to the present, where we have representative government simultaneously with the legacy of racial strife, is set here in 1619 together, that paradox simultaneously. We're going to see this happen time and time again. So in 1622, Chief Powhatan dies, and this uneasy relationship that the Jamestown settlers had with the Native Americans essentially begins to fall apart, right? In 1624, the Virginia charter over Jamestown is revoked when Chief Powhatan's brother almost wipes out. Like, he comes in, he's essentially not wanting the relationship that they have, and it almost kills all of the Jamestown settlers. So they end up making it past this, and you know, without this help, they're essentially on their own, right? Fortunately for the Jamestown, maybe unfortunately for the Native Americans, what changes here is they discover tobacco, and so tobacco really is this game changer for Jamestown. Jamestown was essentially a failure financially. It was a financial initiative. It was a plot for financial gain and essentially creates no return. But with the discovery of tobacco, Jamestown essentially changes almost overnight, right? So it goes from this place where English people were going for searching for opportunity, and essentially most people went there and died, either through starvation, disease, or being killed by Native Americans or in battle with Native Americans, to a place where people could go and essentially become insanely wealthy, right? So tobacco, just explodes. There's like, in 1620, it's like 60,000 pounds of tobacco is going back to England. By 1700, there's like 35, 40 million pounds of tobacco going from the coast of Virginia all the way back to England, right? What I want us to think about is the effects of tobacco on class relations, society in early Virginia, and eventually how it helps create racial slavery in Virginia. When tobacco explodes, all of a sudden people really want to come to the New World, because England is a very class divided place. And so if you're not a noble, if you're, the third son of a nobody, in England, you essentially are very limited in what you can become in life, right? So now that there's a place to go where if you don't have much, you can go there and potentially become extremely wealthy, it really opens the New World back up to a lot of English people. This is going to drive immigration to the New World substantially, but it's going to do it in very specific ways. If you are able to pay your way over to the New World, then you are given 50 acres of farmland as a land grant. So just your ability to get there, provide for yourself to get over there, you can become a tobacco farmer and potentially become insanely wealthy. If you are not able to pay your way over, you can sign an indentured servitude. What is a contract where you sign away 4 to 7 years of your life to work for somebody who could pay your way. And the idea here is that after that contract is fulfilled, then you will get 50 acres of land or some acres of land to live on, potentially become a very wealthy tobacco farmer yourself. So this is very important because it's going to create an influx of economically diverse people, largely males, in the New World. Now, indentured servitude, which is a word you probably remember from high school or even potentially middle school, creates essentially a class of people in the New World that are below large landowners. So these people who come over under the headright system, and this is what it's called, that are able to pay their way over, they get a land grant, they have 50 acres of good farmland. Typically, that's going to be the best farmlands, the one near the water. You can see how, as time goes on, the families of those initial people who come over are able to become really wealthy and to pass that wealth on. Some of these families that are there in Virginia now go all the way back to this initial settlement. These poorer farmers are often going to remember or see themselves as entering into these contracts sometimes they're going to see the people they're working for as they don't like it, right? Maybe they feel like they're treated badly. Oftentimes under the contract that they sign, the indentured servant, there might be stipulations that say if you have a child, you get an additional year or two added to your indentured servitude. If you try to run away, you can get more time added. So you can see how that there's these clauses where it essentially creates an indefinite period of servitude for a lot of people. This is obviously not going to be ideal for a lot of people. Two, as people begin to become free, if they fill their contracts, they're beginning to eat up land. And then you can see how, especially as some land is better than others, if it's closer to water, if it's more fertile, this is going to cause kind of class problems too. So early on, these indentured servants, largely but not always male, this is important. The demographics are very skewed in early Virginia, largely male. It's going to create this stratified society, right? So eventually you're going to have these large planter elites, and then you're also going to have these poorer farmers. And there's this word yeoman that becomes very important here, because even though there is a class distinction where we begin to have more elite people who are more wealthy, and then we have these poorer farmers often that aren't able to have indentured servants or slaves as we begin to see slavery begin to settle in. This term yeoman becomes very important, because the idea here is that even if you are a poor farmer in the New World, you are a master of your own world, right? You have your home, you have your plot of land, you are free, and you're not subject essentially to the oversight of other people. And this becomes something it's a driver, right, of people. Notice this idea of individualism becomes very important. That word yeoman farmer is going to become very important as we begin to move into the early United States and how people think about individualism and self-autonomy. So another thing that really is significant in this early evolution that happens in Virginia is the emergence of slave codes. And what I want us to think about is how historians talk about societies with slaves, essentially societies where slavery exists, but everything isn't built on it, how they evolve into slave societies, where literally everything is built on the institution of slavery. And this is a story of Virginia very early on. From the 1600s really to about 1705, we see the status of enslaved, specifically African slaves that come imported through the Atlantic slave trade into Virginia beginning in 1619, and then moving on, we begin to see the legal code pass laws that creates racial categories that weren't as clear early on. So we have examples of African slaves who eventually became manumitted or free, who became farmers, some of which even owned slaves themselves. This is something that is possible in early Virginia, right? Early 1600s. By 1705, it's an almost impossibility. There is freedom that still happens on small scale, but we can see how racial slavery becomes a permanent institution by the early 1700s. And one way that we can really see this is the slave codes. So I want us to think about how if there are laws on the books, laws serve a purpose. If a law is passed, it's essentially trying to make people behave in a certain way or to prohibit behavior, right? So you're passing a law, coercing someone to do something or to say they can't do it, right? And so when we look at these early slave codes, beginning in the early 1600s, mid 1600s, moving towards 1705, we see the creation of racial categories that didn't exist prior to this. A really good example, we can start moving through and looking at a few of these. In the early 1600s, we have certain things that begin to pass that say exclude black people from being able to possess guns, right? So gun ownership prohibited 1630s and 40s, where black Virginians can't own guns. Very important, 1660s, 1662, children born to enslaved women will also be a slave, right? So that tells you that there are these, people being born to slaves, and in their status, their lifelong status as free or slave is indefinite, right? There's a question about it. And so you have people coming in and they're saying, well, we want to not have a question about this. And one way to do this is we can trace through the woman. We see where the children come from. That was going to define them as a slave for life, right? 1667, baptism does not bring freedom to blacks. What that tells you is that there is this question about religion and Christianity. If most Virginians here are Anglican Christians, they are Protestant, English Protestant Christians, and there's a question, well, should Christians enslave other Christians, right? They begin to have this conversation, and very quickly they decide conversion, African slaves coming here and converting to Christianity does not ensure their freedom. It's a very, very important distinction. 1672, it becomes legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. Offers to Native Americans who capture escaped slaves and return them. That gives you insight into what's going on there, right? You were able to begin to use violence against slaves, and you can see that there is a pitting of Native Americans. Also, there's a question about Native Americans' relationship to slaves. 1680, Virginia Assembly restricts the ability of slaves to meet in gatherings, including funerals. Whites can kill an enslaved escape who resists. Slaves are forbidden to arm themselves, either in offensive or defensive. So we've already seen the possession of arms, but then they're not able to arm themselves. They're unable to leave plantations without the written permission of overseers or masters. If you look at some of these slave codes that get passed, I mean, look, the ability to own arms, to freely assemble, these are literally what will become enshrined as inalienable rights in the Bill of Rights after the passing of the Constitution later. So I want us to see how these slave codes, which we're going to see here, begin to systematically take away what will become thought of as inherent rights, right? Human rights. And we're going to see this time and time again. We're going to see this here. We're going to see this again after the Civil War. We'll begin to see black codes in the South begin to emerge, and they look very similar to these slave codes here. Very specific in their intentionality of taking away the ability to do things that are seen as inalienable rights. 1691, any white person married to a black person or mixed is banished. You can see what's happening here. There is this, what that tells you is that there is intermarriage happening, and there's a question over it, and the powers that be at this juncture are essentially saying we have to decide, what are these people going to be free, or are these people going to be slaves? And very unfortunately, they decide that they are going to either be slaves or they're going to be expelled from the community. Partners in an interracial marriage cannot stay in the colony for more than 3 months after married, so there is intermarriage, and then those people are pushed out. English women, this is very important. English women who give birth to a mixed child are fined. If a woman cannot pay, she serves 5 years as an indentured servant. If the mother is an indentured servant, she faces an additional 5 years. Very important here, one of the readings that we're going to see is an appeal of a person for their freedom, right? And this is a really important law. Mixed children born to a white indentured servant will serve a 30-year indenture. Very important here. If we look at the relationship to the law, these questions about religion and Christianity, when we begin to read our primary source document, I want us to be able to understand the context of what appeals are being made to the judge in that document. Masters must transport emancipated slaves out of Virginia within 6 months after receiving freedom here in the 1680s, right? 1692, slaves are denied jury trials for capital offenses. A minimum of 4 justices will hear the evidence. Slaves cannot own horses, cattle, or hogs, the inability to obtain property. 1705, free men of color lose right to hold public office, taking away political rights. And then by 1705, all black, mixed, and Indian slaves are considered real property. That's like saying real estate. It's a almost like an inanimate object. You can see that by 1705, enshrined through this evolution of legal statutes, we're going to see the creation of race. So whereas there were, black slaves, white servants, there's these, mixture, these kind of indefined categories of people in early 1600s in Virginia. By the 1700s, we have more defined, less fluid categories that begin to be enshrined. One really good event that helps us understand the evolution of racial slavery, indentured servitude, these categories that we're talking about in early Virginia, is Bacon's Rebellion. So we've seen how from 1640s really into, to early 1700s, 1705, we see the creation of legal race, right, that did not exist prior. Bacon's Rebellion is a really good insight into how that begins to happen. So this is 1676, right in the middle of that legal evolution that's happened. You essentially have a mini civil war that happens in early Virginia. Bacon is this elite English colonist who really has it pretty well. He thinks there needs to be a blanket aggressive policy to Native Americans. And there is a very uneasy peace that exists. There are people in Virginia colonies who think that there just needs to be all-out war with the Native Americans. And so Bacon is essentially going to say Jamestown needs to take a more aggressive policy towards the Native Americans. The governor, the English governor of the time, is going to reject that, saying that's going to cause more problems than it helps. We don't want to rock the boat, is essentially his perspective. Bacon is going to be able to pull together a group of people. Despite him being an elite, he's going to pull poor white people together, indentured servants, black slaves, a number of people together to essentially try to overthrow the government of Jamestown. And he's almost successful. They burn Jamestown. This is a full-on mini civil war that's happening. Eventually, however, Bacon is going to die suddenly, which is something that happens in the 16 to 1700s. Unfortunately, life is precious and fleeting at the time. So he dies of dysentery, stomach sickness, and then when he dies, the coalition essentially falls apart. So, but what happens is, on the back end of Bacon's Rebellion, the government is going to want to come in and solidify the elite's control over indentured servants, black slaves, and so in order to do that, they're going to further that distinction by continuing to perpetuate these slave codes that make slavery for black Africans lifelong instead of indefinite.